Blood satellite.
We're going to move on to the next thing because we could talk about this next thing for a while, but I wanted to lead into it with this paper that I found, and I'm just going to briefly go over a couple of interesting things I found in it. It's about language, and the title is Cultural Thought Patterns in Intercultural Education by Robert B. Kaplan from the University of Southern California. So, in short, what this paper is about, it's about ESL. It's about people who learn English. And what they found was that, actually, I'll read the beginning here just to give it a brief intro. The teaching of reading and composition to foreign students does differ from the teaching of reading and comprehension to American students, and cultural differences in the nature of rhetoric supply the key difference in the teaching approach. Language teachers, particularly teachers in English as a second language, are latecomers in the area of international education. And I'm just going to stop quoting it there. Basically, it's a paper about how we teach English to non-English speakers and the problems we run into. And the main focus of this paper is kind of how like an Asian person or a Slavic person or whoever structures their paragraphs, or even if you teach them the language very well, the way information flows out of them and the way information flows in their mind is inherently different. And I'm just going to read a couple of things here that I found interesting. He says here, the English language and its related thought patterns have evolved out of the Anglo-European cultural pattern. The expected sequence of thought in English is essentially a Platonic Aristotelian sequence descended from the philosophers of ancient Greece and shaped subsequently by Roman, medieval European, and later Western thinkers. It is not a better nor a worse system than any other, but it is different. And what he's saying there is like the language is representative of the thought pattern. And we've discussed this now and again before on the show, that when you learn another language, like if you learn Russian, you're not just learning the speech, you're not just learning the grammar, you're actually learning an entire different way of thinking, a different way of approaching the world. And people will sometimes laugh like, oh, Eskimos have 1,000 words for fish and no word for whatever. But it's like, yeah, but that's kind of the point of it. The point of like how they structure their sentences, how they structure their paragraphs, kind of it's a different way to decode information and to view the world. He says the thought patterns which speakers and readers of English appear to expect as an integral part of their communication is a sequence that is dominantly linear in its development. An English expository paragraph usually begins with a topic statement and then by a series of subdivisions of that topic statement, each supported by an example and illustrations, proceeds to develop the central idea. He's got a thing here. It says, some Oriental writing, on the other hand, is marked by what may be called an approach by indirection. In this kind of writing, the development of the paragraph may be said to be turning and turning in a widening gyre. The circles or gyres turn around the subject and show it from a variety of tangential views, but the subject is never looked at directly. Things are developed in terms of what they are not, rather than in terms of what they are. Again, such a development in a modern English paragraph would strike the English reader as awkward and unnecessarily indirect. He's got a few examples here. I won't go into the examples, but just to flash forward ahead, later on in the piece, he's got a page 15 for people who find this thing, Cultural Thought Patterns in Intercultural Education. He's got like a series of pictograms here that shows like English versus Semitic versus Oriental versus Romance versus Russian, different types of language. And English is just an arrow pointing down. Semitic is like a left to right zigzag going down. Oriental is like a spiral going inward. Romance, it's like a weird map. It goes down then across, and Russian is kind of the same. And the Russian example he gave was like the way they write their paragraphs is like, they'll start with two small sentences and then like one giant run-on sentence at the end. That where all the stuff is. It's sort of this like meandering way of talking. But he says this is actually indicative of how these different cultural mindsets approach the world and approach truth itself. And he's only using this in the framework of how you would teach English to them. It's like saying like, oh, we don't teach English, we just teach them grammar and hope them to be good at it, and we think they're doing it wrong when we ask them to write an essay, because all these Arabic guys are coming up with these weird fucked up essays that don't flow together properly. But that's the utilitarian approach to it. But I think hidden within that is a real a fundamental racist truth that could be viewed linguistically, but it's like, that's the difference in the worldview and the culture is so deep in people, and I don't think you can unlearn that. And this is something that I don't know if you've approached this, but me and my wife, we've discussed about like our son or our children learning a second language. Have you talked about this with your wife?
Yes, a little bit.
Where did you land on that? Did you decide whether or not you're like going to, because in Canada there's like French as a second language, but what did you
Well,
decide?
it's different. It's different for us because like it's Hong Kong versus Canada, right? But the native language of Hong Kong is Cantonese, which is essentially a dead language unless the Chinese government falls. Like they're in the active process of killing off all these languages. And my wife doesn't even really speak it that much. So, and we're Canadian, so there's no point.
A lot of Europeans will make fun of us Westerners because we only speak English. I will often tell them I took, how many years of French did we take in school? Serious French. Like, what, 10 years? We stopped in grade 9, right? So that's like 9 years of learning French, right?
Yeah.
I do not speak French. No one I know speaks French. You don't speak French. So we've had, imagine learning a language for 9 years and not being able to speak it. That's the experience many Canadians
It's like
have.
a federal idiosyncrasy of Canada, though. Like the truth is, that you would learn to speak French if you lived on the border with French-speaking people, and there are people in the borderland of our province that speak both languages because they live in the borderland. But I mean, the distance from here to Quebec is farther than the distance across Germany. So, like, I think the scale, the Europeans, and also, I like the idea of being like, oh, we're so culturally, erudite, fine, but also, is it really effective for you to have to know 9 languages just to talk to people technically within a 2-hour range of your home? I think it's better to have a language, a great language like English that's spoken across an entire continent. I think that's just a strong empire. So I think it kind of sucks to have to learn that many languages.
Also, counterpoint to that, there's a, an incalculable amount of white virgins who learned Japanese by sheer will alone. They've
Yeah,
never met a Japanese person.
mm,
It's just their
they will not
passion.
reproduce.
They will. That's a different sort of thing. But you are right. But that's something I discussed with my wife. Like, she had this idea in her head that she wanted our son to learn Latin, and maybe we're being a couple of mean lords about it. But one thing that became apparent to me, and I've known a lot of Europeans, Eastern Europeans who learned how to speak English. No one in particular, like when I was growing up, and the thing that they would complain about is that the more time they spoke English, they would get better at English. They were never perfect at it, but the better they got at English, the worse they would get in their native tongue, and they get made fun of by their friends for it as well. So it seems like you always occupy this middle ground where you can become, the more competent you become in more language. Like, no one's really fluent in all these languages. They can't be. I
Well,
don't
and
think.
that's another funny thing too, because like the you're talking about foreign languages spoken by like immigrant groups in monoculture, or what ought to be a monoculture, and so you have them kind of picking and choosing, where it's like if those people, like if Markham was its own country, and within that country Chinese was the language, and outside of it English was the language, you wouldn't have that problem. But and you probably the people, what I'm saying is like the people that had to go and work in Markham who were English would speak shitty Chinese, but they wouldn't get made fun of because, well, you're not from here. You know what I mean? But the fact that you're trying to make everybody integrate is where you get these problems where it's like, oh, you don't speak English enough to be one of us, but you don't speak Chinese well enough to be one of them. Like, you shouldn't, the real story is you just shouldn't be here.
Yeah, I would also say that I think the commonality here is that most of the people we hear this from are Europeans, and the argument being made here is that the European languages generally wouldn't be so different that it wouldn't be like, oh, I'm an English speaker and I'm just going to learn
Also true.
Cantonese.
Yeah, for
Like
sure.
that would be like, I don't know, don't bother unless you're a diplomat, I guess.
Also, the goofball Dutch guy who speaks 9 different European languages. I don't think you're impressing any Norwegians with your Norwegian. I don't think when you go down to Florence and order some meatballs, they're really impressed with your Italian.
Yeah.
I think you can get by, and the Italians are comfortable enough with nobody speaking fucking Italian correct that they've given up on mocking you, right?
Now, you're not talking about who I think you're talking about. You're not talking about our Faust.
No, I would
My
never
Faust?
say that about your Faust. A big boy.
He'll break
big-
you. He'll
big
break
boy
me
in the-
and you over his knee like Bane at once.
You will.
He's
Yeah.
7.5 feet tall.
I told him the other day, you can take these 2 lips and kiss my ass.
Wait, I mean these like his lips or your lips?
Oh, I said that wrong. Ah, shit.
You take
I mean,
your own
take
lips.
take your 2 lips and kiss my ass. Fuck! Not with my lips. Oh no, I've ruined it now.
Yeah, you can take these 2 cheeks and fuck them. Ah, shit. I said that wrong. Well, what was it supposed to be? All right, so that leads gracefully into our next topic,
Right.
which is a book that I read, and we could spend a lot of time on this. I liked this book. It's a book by an individual who's a bit contentious in our scene, especially for those who are into geopolitics. But he's a well-known name, Peter Zeihan. And this is his first book. He has another one out right now. I didn't get around to it. From what I hear, I might like it a bit less than this one because I quite liked this one called Disunited Nations. And so this was published a few years ago. So obviously he's probably got to update some theories. He's in these geopolitical circles. He's in interviews and he's got a podcast. And I think you'd find him interesting if you haven't really heard of him before, but he's very hawkish on China.
Peter Zeihan, yeah, I've heard of him.
Peter Zeihan. He's been predicting the fall of China for quite some time. And by fall of China, I mean complete and utter collapse of China. So he's been kind of in the news because he says, oh, within 5 years, China's going to be complete rubble and it'll be a refugee crisis. And he said that 10 years ago. So my feeling is he makes those predictions for the same reason anyone does, because it gets him in the press, whether or not he truly believes that. But go into this book knowing that he's made some hard predictions that have not come true. However, my position on specifically his China predictions have been like, his predictions have been wrong, but his data inputs and his logic and reasoning seem sound to me. So, for example, and actually he spends quite a bit of this book being anti-China. So the purpose of the book, Disunited Nations, just to give you a brief overview, and then we'll get into the details, it's that the current world order, he calls it the order, is controlled by America. And by the order, we mean general trade security and economic security is assured by America. There most likely will be an eventuality where America retreats from its global security position and its economic stewardship and will thrust the world into a multipolar state.
Every country basically has 3 paths to choose from. Number 1, you kind of glom on to a country where this isn't a big deal. So in the case of Mexico, you obviously partner with the United States. The Japanese, for example, have decided that that's the way to go. And they cut a deal with both Donald Trump and Joe Biden. The Japanese are the only country to pull that off so far, and they are now part of the inner circle of the American strategic network. Second, you can find a way to go it alone. Maybe you don't need the allies. Maybe what you need is close and you can do kind of a neo-imperial system. I can see the French doing this. I can see the Turks doing this. Option 3 is you just figure out how to go without.
And it'll be a very disjointed, chaotic world. And this book seeks to answer, like, what will happen? And he spends the entire book looking at specific core areas and power players in the world. He goes to Brazil, he goes to Japan, Saudi Arabia, Britain, France, and says, if America were to retreat from its position, still be America, still exist, not collapse, but stop, holding up global trade, what would happen? What would happen, and what's the likelihood that these nations would not only survive but thrive? And he goes into great detail. And what I found was, even if people disagree on his conclusions, I think they're great conversation starters because he makes some pretty bold predictions, but he also explains them. And I will also say that a lot of people in our scene specifically have taken issue with him because he according to him, he's a Jared Diamond gun, germs, and steel sort of guy when it comes to issues of race and ethnicity. What that means is that he subscribes to a belief that certain ethnicities are the way they are because of environmental and geographic limitations. And the claim made by Jared Diamond, which was roundly debunked, if people want to look this up, debunked by a guy that a lot of people might know, Alt Hype. Look up, he's got a video debunking guns, germs, and steel. That book, he claims that why doesn't Africa have domesticated animals like the West? And he said, well, it must be that there's no domesticable animals there, right? All the animals that can be domesticated were domesticated, which is false.
Now, Jared Diamond's core argument about the prevalence of domesticable crops and animals, if it were true, could explain why Eurasia was ahead of Africa and the Americas. His core argument only argues why Eurasia was ahead of everywhere else. It does not argue for Europe being ahead of India and China. Jared does offer some explanations for that at the end, but those are tacked on. 90% of the book is about domesticable crops and animals and about arable land, variations which are not only do not explain Europe shooting past India and China, but are in fact a mark against his core argument, since Europe was clearly inferior to India and China in this regard.
A bunch of white guys went to Africa and domesticated a bunch of animals just for fun. It's just that Africans just decided not to. And it's very hard to domesticate. You can domesticate nearly anything. It's just whether you do it or not. Look at what fucking Arabs did with camels. Camels are not easy to domesticate. Fuck off. Horses are not easy to domesticate. So that's Peter Zeihan's position. Although in the book, he makes allusions that he's aware of ethnicity and he's aware of ethnic conflict. Like, for example, we'll get into this later, but he says that, in this disunited world, France could return to sort of a geopolitical dominance because the EU might very well crumble. But he points to that the intra-ethnic conflict in France will probably tear it apart. It's like he's aware of it. He's aware of the migration crisis. But my issue is he does not apply that criticism even-handedly. Another one, just to get a couple off the top to let people know where I'm coming from. One thing he says is that the main thrust of the book is that if America retreats from its security position, it'll still largely be the most dominant nation in the world. And and the reason we think this is happening is because America has been withdrawing its troops in huge numbers over the past decade or so. And he says, well, if that continues, then that's going to have ramifications. But he says, America's still going to have the best militaries. So he says, it could still militarily accomplish its interests with its military or with its information intelligence infrastructure, with its special forces, with anything. So it could still strike out wherever the fuck it wants. It just wouldn't be, in his words, setting the stage for everyone to be able to participate in this sort of liberal, democratic, capitalist system. It'll just fall to, winner takes all, whatever. Old rivalries reemerge, and then trade becomes a lot more complicated, and decoupling from the dollar, all that becomes a lot more complicated. But one thing he had said was that America will still be there, but he says he's also predicting Russia will collapse. Russia is on the verge of collapsing. It always has been.
The KGB basically overthrew the other factions within the Soviet ruling coalition within the Communist Party. And so Andropov, Chermyrdin, Gorbachev were all heirs to that legacy, and Putin is the inheritor of that legacy. Now you combine that concentration of power with the collapse of the educational system in the Soviet system around 1986, with the country's demographic collapse, and it means that the total elite throughout the entire Russian system is only about 130 people, and Putin has had 23 years to basically purge it down to the people that he feels he can trust. So if Putin were to slip in the shower and fall into some duct tape and sit in a chair and throw himself into a pool, we probably wouldn't have any serious policy changes because everybody who's left is more or less on the same page. Okay, so with an elite that is that concentrated and that small, the capacity to manage the entire system is limited. Now, this isn't quite as bad as it is in China. I mean, China's a one-man show now, and even if Xi Jinping were the smartest person on the planet, he still wouldn't be able to micromanage everything in the system, and that's why we're seeing the policy ossification and cracks forming throughout the entire Chinese system. That's not that bad in Russia, but Putin has had to reach out to manage this system by allying with other factions. At one point, there was a bunch of technocrats like the former finance minister Kudrin, but more reliably, he's partnered with organized crime. This is one of the reasons why the Russians have proven to be so troubled in cyberspace until very recently. So you've got this concentration of power, which urges corruption, that is partnered with organized crime, which loves corruption. And as a result, the whole system is cracking apart.
And one of the reasons he cites is that Russia internally has a lot of intra-ethnic conflict. It's not a homogenous nation. It's not united in any way internally, ethnically, and it's on the brink of collapse, and it probably will. To which I would say, well, if you can say that about Russia, you can say that about America. Like, what screams intra-ethnic conflict more than the United States of America? Like, everyone in the world fucking knows that, right? So to say that that's going to, for sure, destroy Russia, but not have any impact whatsoever on America, I don't buy it. So, when he's predicting the downfall of Russia and China, I don't see that. However, with China, he makes a few good points. I was wondering if you wanted to even jump in here when I talked about China, because it's the stuff you had talked about, where he says, like, look, we talk about the declining birth rate in America fucking everything up. Well, there's also a declining birth rate in China. That's a big problem that a lot of people don't talk about.
We've never had a country die for demographic reasons. It's just never happened because we've never, remember, this started with industrialization and urbanization. Yeah. That is, historically speaking, a relatively recent development. But what we do know is that when you run out of people who are age 20 and under, you actually get faster growth for a while because all the money you used to spend on your children, you're spending on consumption and investment. And then when you run out of people aged 40 and under, you then start seeing the explosion in labor costs. And China has now been in that environment for 20 years. So the cost of labor in China has gone up by a factor of almost 15 since the year 2000, which, again, historically unprecedented. We're now in an environment where there is not a single manufacturing subsector where China is competitive. They have the advantage of the sunk industrial plant and obviously a robust subsidy system, but in a head-to-head competition with anyone, unless those subsidies get really out of control, the Chinese lose on both quality and speed. This is only going to get worse because now we're in an environment where they're running out of people aged 50 and under, and that means it's eating into their skilled labor as well.
He says a point he makes here is that while China was creating a lot of credit and a lot of debt to finance their growth, there's a difference between good debt and bad debt. Good debt can be paid back. Bad debt is just a liability. And that's kind of what happened in America in the financial crisis. So he said, the amount of Chinese debt that's gone bad over the past few decades is 8.5 trillion. And they don't really seem interested in innovation or traditional laws of economics. He says in China, there's a big problem, and you let me know if this is true. He says, it's more common in China for people to buy investment properties. So, a lot of the problems we have in America, where it's it's all the real estate market's all speculative. That's 5 times worse in China, and it's all bought through credit. Does that sound like something you witnessed when you lived in that area?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. He says, there's China's got an over demand and an entirely hollow economy. He says the problem with China is that okay? So the question on everyone's mind is who can replace America? And there's a lot of third worldists out there who say China can replace America, as the biggest economy. You hear that all the time. China's this huge juggernaut of an economy. And he says, well, here's the problem. It's that America's consumer-driven market is a massive production sink for the whole world. And if you remove the American market from the world, all other nations they can't even produce that much. Like there's not enough people buying it. So he's like, in China, their consumer market isn't that good. So the question is not just what they can produce, can they buy? Because America buys a lot of shit that props up a lot of this manufacturing sector. If America stops, the Chinese people aren't actually consuming all the world's stuff. So like they wouldn't be a big power player for trade, and they wouldn't be that sort of like economic sink to hold up all this global production. And also he said, like, if America retreated, like the big problem he mentions with China, and I think this is true because the last couple of things I mentioned, they are true, right? Okay, here's another thing that's true. He says, the land in China isn't that great. The way it's laid out with its capital cities so far from each other, like it doesn't really make a lot of sense to move resources between each other. He says one of the things, what America promises the world with the order, because that's what we're talking about, the order. It's that not only will we provide, the standardized dollar, we're also going to provide all the maritime trade routes, maritime security, physical security, access to open markets. That's a big one that America promises. Then the floating global currency that I discussed. China not only can't provide all that, I don't think it wants to. You see what I'm saying? Like you have to, we talked about last episode about Turbo America, or maybe a couple episodes ago, Turbo America. This book seeks to answer, like, what is Turbo America? How does Turbo America function? What are the actual what are the dimensions to its power? And once you break down those dimensions, like I just did, that's like, okay, what could step into that place? And the problem with China, and I think this is true, and it may correct me if I'm wrong, but like China has a terrible relationship with the rest of the world. China has a terrible relationship with its neighbors, and China doesn't seem to be interested in having relationships that would put it in a dominant position, because America, no matter what you think about America, a lot of people think the world hates America. They don't really. They might talk shit about America. They might make fun of America. But there's more countries that are reliant on what America offers in terms of like the global open marketplace for trade than anything else, right? They like that. They would rather that not go. But I think, and he makes a point in the book that America can accomplish this because it was a relatively new nation. There's not really a lot of people that have ancient animosity towards America. There's a lot of nations that have an ancient animosity towards China. And in my opinion, this is why, true unity between China and Russia can't really exist. Like, it comes down to China kind of believing that it's the best and believing that every other nation is beneath them. So it's like, they're not a country that could even set up an infrastructure like America has. Does that sound like it makes any sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
All right. And in terms of what the order is, so he says America formed a new world order called the Order through the Bretton Woods trade alliances to defeat the Soviet Union after World War II. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, George H.W. Bush kind of tried to redirect the momentum of this trade system, which wasn't really taken up by any subsequent president, because it was essentially an imperialist system. And subsequent presidents didn't want to engage in imperialist projects. They kind of just let it falter and wane. They didn't want to continue that sort of imperialistic economic project, which was designed to be against like one enemy. So the Order, which is essentially America's economic system, stopped demanding anything of its beneficiaries, because the idea was that for people to be a part of this American system, there were certain things that America would provide to entice them. One was the trade routes. The other was that, in his words, America would bleed for its member states. So if you were within the American sphere of influence, you could count on America to send its young men to fight for you. Now, this doesn't sound very good to American young men, But that explains all these fucking wars. Like, why are we going to war here or there? It's for this system. It's because you actually need America needs to be seen to sacrifice to maintain the system so that other countries don't need to, and then they will participate in it and essentially become vassal states. But that is the trade-off. And he points to 9/11 as one of the main reasons why America started retreating from this, because when America actually did call on its member states to go fight for them, no one really did. Canada did, a few others did, but there was way more pushback from countries that it thought would be on its side, I think, and there's a lot more ambivalence towards that one time America really wanted to just be a gangster for a minute, and then they said, okay, well, fuck this. That's kind of the argument he's making here. And the other problem with the order was that it wasn't really set up to benefit Americans. It was set up to kind of benefit American business, but the effect of this new world economic order was the hollowing out of American industry. So that's why, like, this order, even though Turbo America is in charge, that's why Americans aren't very happy. And we'll get into this when we talk about the economic and the federal bank and the global credit market in the next few episodes. But it's this idea that Americans generally didn't, if it is an imperialist project, Americans didn't really benefit any way other than additional trade being that economic sink for the rest of the world. So we get all these like imports, but you also lose your job and become, it doesn't feel very good living in the center of the empire for a lot of people. And the way America can do this is, like, what it's promising is, if with us in charge, you can pursue economic self-interest. And America is very good at finding forces and groups within these nations and trying to appeal to them. We talked about in the previous episode about how, elites deal with other elites. Like, you could actually get Japan on board by saying, like, okay, you can get rich from doing this, but you can't talk to the people. You have to talk to, like, the business owners and the titans of industry. And when he says that America will, like, retreat from the system, there's going to be a lot of, shocks that hit the rest of the world. And he says that, the imposition of the American order, as we know it, meant more nations could be reliant on food imports, which tripled population growth. If that changes, that population growth goes into reverse. This is another thing you said about China. Like, if you look at China, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, there's an immense amount of food imports that go into China. That China, at some point, I don't know when it happened, but I think they import most of their rice, don't they? Did we talk about this before?
They're massive net food importers. Rice, I don't know about rice because they have a whole system for that, but they import most of their soy and pork. They're like the world's largest consumer of pork. So, like, globally, they're just sucking up all the pork on the planet.
Yeah, he says, like, 1/5 of all agriculture is internationally traded, but 4/5 are reliant on petroleum-derived inputs. So now we're talking about the petroleum market. We're talking about the oil market. We're talking about, like, not just food trade, but this entire very multifaceted, complex system where, we'll get into this a bit later, or maybe we won't, but I'll just talk about it now. But, like, an entity like Saudi Arabia becomes a lot more complicated in a multipolar world. Like, where do you think Saudi Arabia fits? Where do you think the oil markets start to go? There's relative balance within this status quo. Last episode, we talked about this idea of status quo and politics among nations by Morgenthau. But, the Turbo America status quo, once you upset the status quo, you're going to see a lot of famine. And it's not going to happen tomorrow, but it'll happen by degrees. But he said, like, in this chaotic world, like, the America that you might see, the America that he's predicting, and again, some people might disagree with this, but it's a good conversation starter. He said, you'll see the rise of dollar diplomacy. And the dollar diplomacy will step in to replace the military as the troops start coming home, as the bases start to close. Dollar diplomacy, where American state actors are working through business to maintain trade dependency, while the American military, he uses this phrase, used more kinetically to fulfill American interests rather than maintain world order. So you'll start to see, like, and we actually kind of see this now when people talk about these, tech companies who are in bed with the CIA, who are in bed with like basically the government or state actors. Like that's going to be the norm. Like you're going to just see international business as a front for American state interests, which again, like Raytheon and all these other companies and BlackRock. Like, what is BlackRock as an organization? It's so intertwined with the Federal Reserve and the government. But that's going to be the model for everything going forward, which is really just the elites operating with a different configuration, but essentially the same thing. A point he makes on the military front, though, when I said he can behave more kinetically, he said America's special forces number around 70,000. Even if America removes its investment from the world, it still has the power to reach anywhere, especially if it has global interests. So what you see here, what he's kind of getting at, is you'll still see an American hegemony, but with no responsibility to world security. He makes a point here, and this will be people could talk about this forever, but it's like any disruption to global supply lines, which will be expected in this sort of eventuality, encourages companies to put more factories in NAFTA zones since it requires less investment, and disruption encourages capital flows into the American system. So it could come to pass that America seeks out global trade disruptions using this new form of military, which is just to like reach out and assassinate, or reach out and do like a flash invasion, not have, military bases ever, but just like go in and get out with the special forces. I don't know if we'll have time to go through every country, because like I said, he dedicates an entire chapter to every country, and every country that matters. Even Canada gets a mention. It's not looking good for Canada in this system, by the way. And it mainly comes back to that Canada's pretty poor relationship with America will become very real. Like Canada will have to like kind of nut up and say like, why does America need to put up with Canada being so shitty and being so difficult towards it? If and we talked about this in a previous episode, where if you look at Canadian provinces, each Canadian province has stronger trade with America than it does with each other.
The population is stretched out, basically hugging the American border for warmth. And because of the way that Canada was formed as a co-dominion of Anglos in Ontario and Quebecois in Quebec, you have made the decision very early on in your process that the provinces have immense power vis-a-vis the central government. That means you didn't get your first trade deal until about 3 years ago. When I say trade deal, not with another country, within Canada. So internal barriers to trade remain immense, and almost every province in the Canadian system, as this graphic shows, has a greater an economic relationship south with the United States than it does with their own co-nationals. And in that sort of environment, Canada is always going to be incredibly exposed to international trends, especially as involves the elephant next door.
So if you look at Canadian trade and capital flows, they're all pointing down into America. It's not very lateral. It's not very horizontal at all. And a lot of Canadians have remarked on this. Like there's not a lot of inter-province, unity or strength or trade. So that gets very real very fast when it comes down to why does Canada need to fucking exist at all? maybe it's just Alberta exists as a vassal state of America. Anyway, there's all kinds of speculative stuff you could do. One thing he says about Japan, though, I'm going to kind of just run through these points because I think the points themselves are interesting and maybe they are conversation starters. He says the geography of Japan forces the residents into tightly concentrated urban areas that limit demographic expansion. This is something that people know about, Japan. That's why they tend to build up. That's why they have different living situations there. However, what's interesting, though, is that these urban areas are also independently power generating, and Japan overall is the most advanced for automation and technological independence, because that's a big thing he talks about, like how when the chips are down, can your nation actually generate its own energy, generate its own everything. Japan is in a better position than China is. And he makes a prediction that if once everything goes to shit, Japan is in a better position to project power and influence through the entire Asian region. which would not be historically unprecedented, by the way. Right now, their biggest rival is China, but if he is indeed predicting that China is going to fall, I don't really believe it. But if it is, then like Japan, what you'll actually see is Japan decouple from America at that point, because like Japan doesn't really like being in the American sphere of influence and doesn't need to be. And so that's something you might see. And if Japan becomes an Asian hegemon, then it's a rival to America, and that's a whole different place that they don't want to be in. We've seen what happens there. Yeah, he kind of outlines it here. He says, like, the reason China will not invade Japan is because China needs trade inputs, like we discussed, and could not survive without them. Japan is strong militarily and has a superior navy to China, which isn't nothing. And also, China has poor relationships with all of Asia, while Japan has stronger ties to the West, has stronger ties to the Persian Gulf and India. And due to these connections, it could step up and take control during the American retreat. Again, some people might disagree with that. I think that's a pretty interesting case, and we're going to make a case similar to that when we discuss the book Princes of the Yen in the next couple episodes. But he's got, when he gets into the European Union, it's kind of interesting because he says that if America leaves NATO and just doesn't give a shit about NATO and retreats from that entirely, the outcome for the EU is not good, especially for Germany, who has enthusiastically abandoned their military and are so reliant on a unified EU for their energy and exports. Their most attractive markets are in the East, putting them at odds with Russia. He actually says about France, which is interesting. He said, the reason why France is in such a good position, not demographically, but everything else, it's that France has always kind of fought against being in the European Union, and that it never got rid of its military. Even to this day, the French military is still pretty active and pretty strong. Germany, it's the opposite, but it's like, but because France kept investing so much time and energy and resources into this military, it never trickled down on other developments, other technology that other nations did. So France could stand alone, but it's almost like the least technologically advanced compared to Germany and some other places, which I thought was an interesting way of looking at it. But also, and here's the thing he gets into in this book, and I just want to touch on this for a second. I got into a bit of a debate in the chat. We were talking about the importance of geography in geopolitics. And on the last book we covered, Politics Among Nations by Morgenthau, he was anti-geopolitics. And and more the geo than the politics. So it's this idea, like the guns, germs, and steel thing, that everything is decided by geography. Everything is environmental. And my position was that, geography and environment matters. It's not everything, but waterways matter. The topography of the land matters. He talks about South America in this book, and he says that, and also Africa. He says, Africa is actually just really hard to develop.
What contribution do you see from the African continent in terms of global manufacturing horsepower?
Oh, manufacturing? None, very little. Africa is a series of stacked plateaus, so just getting the infrastructure in there to access anything is very difficult. And while they do have very high birth rates and a more stable population structure, a lot of that is only possible because they export raw commodities and then import the things that allow them to have a degree of modernity. You break down global supply chains, a lot of that goes away.
And there's a lot of stuff, people think of South America as this rich bounty. And he's like, well, there's some facts about the soil in Brazil that aren't great. It's actually pretty hard to grow things there. And actually, there's a lot of sheer cliff sides and mountains there. That's a problem. And people will push back on me correctly, because I'm not saying it's everything, but they'll be like, oh, you know what? Fuck it. White people could make Las Vegas. They can make an oasis in the desert. They can they built fucking Washington, D.C. on a swamp. Agreed. White people are magic. I get it. But also, I can't live in a reality where we talk about geography as if it doesn't matter. As if when we look at France, for example, France has very, admirable and desirable waterways. being near the ocean matters. The fact that Britain or the UK is an island and it's very difficult to invade. It's easier for them to project power than it is to invade them. That matters. The fact that America is probably, for a single nation, the best terrain imaginable. Like it's disgusting how good.
Well, it's huge. I mean, like it's in any historical context, it would be an entire empire unto itself. The number of different biomes and resources that are there,
which is why I don't ever believe there will be this national divorce that people are talking about. I honestly think the elites and the status quo holders in America will never let that happen, because it doesn't make sense that America has so much going for it, just in terms of like the arable land and the desirable, like these amazing rivers that just make it so easy to trade internally. A lot of nations can't trade internally. Anyway, that was the argument he was making about Africa, which is true, that rainforest actually just fucking sucks. It sucks for building trains. It sucks for building roads. Some people will say, well, if you put enough white people there, they could make it work. Agreed. But also, I don't want to remove geography from the conversation, and that's kind of what he's talking about when he talks about places like France, where, like, fact of the matter is that France historically has been so good is because it's got a lot of desirable topographic features, a lot of land that's good for things. Whereas, and yet there's Russia. Russia shouldn't work, and yet Russia does. And that's kind of why I think Russia won't just collapse, because the fact that Russia exists at all is kind of like a furious miracle. We talked about the history of Russia before. Like it's not easy being Russia. Russia has like insane borders to consider, and the fact that it exists at all lends more credence to the idea that it'll exist in the future. What it really gets more interesting, and I guess we could end on this, because we could talk about this for hours and hours and hours, but the one thing that I ended up thinking about a lot was when he gets to the Middle East and he gets to Saudi Arabia and he gets to Iran, because he makes the point that right now the Middle East is in chaos. It's in flux right now. And in fact, the entire Islamic world is. There really is no core center of power for the Islamic power bloc as we know it, whereas other civilizations have a core area. And he said, it could benefit America in the short term once this security state is dismantled, this apparatus is dismantled, because it will thrust the Middle East into a more aggressive balance of power. So you're going to see Iran go to war. You're going to see Saudi Arabia in play. You're going to see Syria. Someone's going to end up taking over Syria. Now, that conflict can work in the short term, but he makes a good point. The problem with any competition is that there's eventually a winner. And he envisions a world where Iran becomes effectively the Islamic center of power for, the Islamic world.
For the Middle East writ large, if you eliminate the administrative staff in Doha and the special forces in Syria, we're already gone. Mm-hmm. Troops in Iraq, there's a few there in an advisory role, but you're talking in the hundreds. We don't have anyone in Saudi Arabia. We don't have anyone in all those supply lines we had to get stuff into Iraq or into Afghanistan. Those are all closed down. So the Fifth Fleet is no longer hanging out in Bahrain. The French typically now have more ships in the Persian Gulf than we do. We're done. That's good and bad. For us, we're obviously like, woo-hoo, shale revolution, we don't care. And, that's exciting after 15 years of crap in the Middle East. But if you're anyone else, this is a bit of a problem, because the Iranians and the Saudis have some very strong opinions about who should be in charge in that part of the world. And if the United States is not there keeping them separate or picking sides, I expect this to boil up into another crisis on a scale roughly similar to that of the Ukraine war.
Because Saudi Arabia, the way he lays out in the book, like Saudi Arabia is very powerful. Saudi Arabia is not even really a country, if you think about it. Saudi Arabia is the House of Saud. Saudi Arabia is just this one royal family.
Right.
And so they don't really function like a nation. They don't have the same considerations as a nation. And he's like,
it's a kingdom.
Yeah, but Saudi Arabia probably won't fall for that reason. He's like, they don't operate like a country because like half their population is like, they import all their labor.
They're slaves.
It's
a slave state.
Yeah.
It's essentially just the Saudi royals and a bunch of slaves that they pay for with oil money. It's like a corporation. It's less like a kingdom. It's more like a corporate park or corporate campus built in the sand. That's essentially
exactly.
what it is.
But he also says that puts them in a good position because they don't need to give a shit about their citizenry.
Right,
they
because
can
they're all
make
slaves.
they can make all kinds of deals, and he envisions a scenario. Again, hear him out. He says like you might even see them ally with Israel at some point, because Israel as like a power player in that area is pretty strong.
That's not a big ask. I mean, neither the Sauds nor the Israelis have any real religious scruples. They're both just power hungry, Semites. So
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like Saudi Arabia, they want what's best for them. They want money. They got the oil, and they will make any. They'll probably ally. There might be some conflict because what Saudi Arabia does, and everyone knows this, is their main thing is exporting terrorists. So that's kind of how they would make power plays in the region. It's that they kind of take their most fucked up guys and just send them out of Saudi Arabia. That's why they're not there. That's why Saudi Arabia is so peaceful. They take all their terrorists and send them off to fucking, I think they're Sunni Muslims. And that's why the Sunni Muslims globally are such a interesting power block.
Now, Saudi Arabia really matters, more so than many of America's true allies, for a couple of reasons. First of all, it sits on the holy sites of Islam, Mecca, Medina, and as so has the ability to reach out to Muslims wherever they happen to be with a significant message that is often taken seriously. And second, it's the world's largest oil exporter, giving just a huge amount of cash to pay for things and to manipulate the markets.
But they says, once they get that in control, they can wield that however they want. And for a while, they might wield it against Iran. They might wield it in favor of a war for Syria. That will make it so it's not being wielded against Europe. But eventually, that'll settle down. And that's a problem. Because in our scene, especially on the far right, I don't think we treat Islam with the care that we should. I think it's seen as old hat. There's not a lot of people in our scene that even talk. In fact, they might talk about Islam like it's based. It's cool. Like
disgusting. Disgusting.
Yeah, but it's like
they should be exterminated.
There's only one. To me, even the migrant flows from Africa, that could be fixed. You could just turn off that spigot pretty easily. But I'm like, you have no idea if the Islamic world were to have a core civilizational area and it was able to kind of get its shit order. That's the actual death of Europe. It's right next door, and there's a lot of them, and they've got systems in place that most people don't even think. They're not this annoying thing that only conservatives care about. And guess what? They're not going to save the West from homosexuality. You're fucking dreaming. They're going to take over. We're kind of lucky right now that they're so in chaos and decentralized right now, but that can change. And he's looking forward to a future where that does change. And, that's why America to this day, that's why they're so worried about Gaddafi. That's why they're so worried about these people who might unify that region. And that's, we talk about Turkey, Turkey is not even taken seriously, but, if we're back to a multipolar world, we're back to a world where Constantinople matters. We're back to a world where the thing that made Turkey and the Ottoman Empire so relevant for so long was its geographic area, it's a trade hub. There's a lot geographically beneficial to that. And so if that becomes relevant again, then that whole, they're holding a lot of keys in this new world order. If you don't have America kind of keeping them down, because that's what America, we can all admit that America right now is keeping a lot of these countries down. They have an interest in keeping chaotic, and we might look at that as imperialistic and evil. And sure, I bet if you were them, you would think the same way. But imagine a world where that changes, where now the Saudis are they got new friends. They're not even talking to anyone else anymore, and they have the House of Saud have all the fucking all the free. I don't know what degeneracy they're into over there in the House of Saud, but it's being supplied by someone over on their side of things. Sorry, I misspoke. It wasn't the Sunnis; it's the Wahhabists. The House of Saud. It's the Wahhabi religion. That's the one that is
Yeah,
the big
it
one.
doesn't really matter that much. I mean, all Islam should be wiped from the face of the earth permanently. I don't really which it doesn't really matter which one.
Yeah, like he makes a claim here is like the Saudis would have an easier time of turning Muslims to do their will than Iran, like turning the Wahhabists. You know, if they send out a signal, the Wahhabists listen to Saudi Arabia more than Iran. Um, what Iran tends to do, he explains in the book, is it tries to turn Muslim minorities against the whole, while the Saudis can corral all the Sunni Muslim majorities within their form of radical Islam. Um, that's their greatest weapon, and it's a decentralized weapon. Um, he makes a point. He says Saudis, they don't care if they win the Middle East as long as Iran loses it. He describes the Saudis as civilizational arsonists. I like that phrase there. Yeah, and like I just say, it says resetting the world order resets history to regional trade powers, where the Turks may once again gain control, especially when viewed in the context of Europe. But the Middle East, where it'll have influence in Europe, but it will be a superpower within the Middle East. And its historical relevance as a trade hub for both land and sea will become relevant once again. And how, like, Turkey, maybe I won't go too much into it, but he said the reason Turkey matters, he says, it's a rare occasion where an empire was left to its own devices after being shattered. So after the Ottoman Empire shattered, you know, it wasn't like decimated like Germany, and it wasn't like brainwashed, and the status quo wasn't inflicted on them. It was kind of left to its own devices, and so you had this sort of Turkish nationalism emerge right after World War One, and it can kind of develop on its own beyond prying eyes. And that's where you get the conflict between the secularists and the Anatolians, which we won't get into right now. But he says, like, you know, in this world, Turkey could make a play for the Balkans within their sphere of influence. That's an easy one. It could carry right on through to Ukraine if it wanted to. If we do see the retreat of Russia, and that what you might see is that Turkish, you know, nationalism doing to them what it did to Germany leading up to World War One. That you might see a rebirth, because, like we talked about before, remember how powerful that German nationalism was. Look at what a proper nationalist movement can accomplish. And maybe the only nationalist movements that I see happening anymore, realistically, like, we're trying to get our own things going here, but it seems like the ones that seem just about there are in Turkey. The only like real nationalist things are like in the fucking Islamic world. How did that happen? You know. Anyway, I won't go into too much. Hey, we gotta get going now. One thing he does end on, and I think this is interesting. He says the next theater of the war on terror. So keep an eye out for this. Maybe he's wrong. He says the next theater of the war on terror will be the Sahel in Africa. He says it's a collection of countries that are hotbeds for terrorism and fractured governments. He's predicting that America will ally with France and conduct a new sort of theater in the war on terror, and it's going to be in Africa this time. So we'll see. We'll see if that happens. Actually, let me just end. Actually, we'll end on Canada. Let me just read this part. He says the American attitude towards Canada is in the process of shifting. Under the order, Canada held a special position in global affairs. It sits astride the ICBM flight paths from the Soviet Union to the United States. That would have enabled the Canadians to be security free riders during the Cold War. To their credit, they were not. They openly and willingly participated in all aspects of North American security policy, but that doesn't mean they didn't use that leverage at all. They deflected it into other realms. Economically, the Canadians proved adept at eking out concessions from the Americans in trade relations, most notably in agriculture, finance, manufacturing, and services. Strategically, the Canadians played middlemen between Americans and pretty much everyone else. With most U.S. foreign policy made by a single person, few aside from the Canadians held a reliable in. Such top-level access meant Canadians wielded amazingly outsized influence in a world of global interconnectedness. No more. The Americans' Cold War mentality is gone. Washington no longer sees value in engaging the world's many countries multilaterally, so while the need for an American whisperer might be higher, the Americans have become mildly offended that anyone might play that role at all. More to the point, the Americans no longer fear a Soviet nuclear assault, so there's no longer leverage to be gained from being on the missile flight paths. Any regard to the Canadians once commanded, any leverage they might have wielded is dust in the wind. So, and also on top of that, we've talked about before that Canada hasn't been very polite to America, and America has frequently been irritated by Canadians' gestures and trade relationships with China. To almost exclusively to spite America. We talked about that a few episodes back. So, there might be more one-sided deals between America and Canada in this world. So anyway, we didn't get to everything. We might revisit some of this in the future because I think there's some South American stuff that's interesting to talk about. But what did you think about all that generally?
It's pretty cool. I kind of agree with your take with Peter Zeihan, that a lot of the time it seems like what he's saying makes sense. It's hard to poke holes in it unless you really get into the weeds. But obviously he doesn't have a really great track record on some of his predictions. But it seems believable. I mean, all of it tracks.
Yeah, like I find that if you read the book, if you read his work, I don't denounce him. A lot of people just hand wave him away. I'm like, well, you should have the wherewithal to pick through it. Like there might be some stuff you agree with, might be some stuff, but you'll have a reason why you disagree with it. It won't just be that I don't like him because I think he's too much of a lib. I'm like, well, no, he might have a lower resolution view in some areas and his predictive power might be off. But like I said, like with the China thing or the Russian thing, I'm like, he's dealing with facts. I just think that his view on the role of ethnicity and the power of this internal civilization, like the idea that China would just fall apart economically just doesn't track with me. It's too ancient. It's been through too much shit. It just seems that it's a different beast. And it hasn't been overrun with black rapists yet. Like they'll figure it out. Like I think the fact that Russia's kind of figured it out and unprecedented things keep happening in Russia, perhaps unprecedented things will continue to happen in Russia. That's my take. So, and if those things don't collapse, well then, then you might see a very different Eurasian theater.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.